The world is changing extremely fast right now in ways that can feel both exciting and overwhelming. So, how do we find balance in all of this? I'm Stephanie von Bismarck, activist, author, and digital educator. Welcome to my podcast, where each week I sit down with some of the world's best thinkers, trailblazers, and extraordinary people to find ways to help us all thrive and answer the big question, how do we manage? Hi, and welcome back. As you know, this podcast is all about how to better manage our lives in this very fast-moving and overstimulating world. And the topic today couldn't be more on brand. More and more of us are now fully paid-up members of the culture of busyness, where we put value in constant productivity and feel extreme guilt for ever stepping off that treadmill. And globally, the World Health Organization attributes 745,000 deaths per year to overwork. My guest is Dr. Joseph Jebelli. He's a neuroscientist, author, and expert on brain health. And his latest book, The Brain at Rest, is all about why it's important to give our brains a break, how to do it, and the long-lasting impact it can have. Dr. Jebelli's insights are perfect for those of us striving to find balance in this overstimulated world. So if you're looking for a bit of peace from all the external noise and internal chatter, you're in the right place. Dr. Joseph Jebelli, welcome to the show.
Hi, good to be with you.
It's great to have you. Some of the listeners might know that we love neuroscientists. Because I think, it's all about finding balance in this world. And one of those big factors, I think, is understanding the human brain, because that helps us to understand how we really are wired. And that probably helps us to find balance in this world that is, fast-paced and overstimulating at times, and that there are certain things to our brain that we most likely won't change ever, at least not now. So thank you so much. And my younger daughter is studying neuroscience, so I'm always very happy to see fellow neuroscientists.
That's wonderful.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about you. How did you discover neuroscience for yourself?
So I was always very interested in the brain from quite a young age. I remember reading, New Scientist and Scientific American, and I would always jump to the neuroscience article, the brain article. I was always just endlessly fascinated by this idea that, that everything we perceive around us, that everything we touch and feel, and even the way we see the world, everything from the color, depth, orientation, that it's all ultimately, electrical cells in our brain just firing and actually decoding the world around us and building this image of the world and building our emotions as well as our memories and our abilities to think critically about things. So I was always interested in it from a young age, and it's sort of gone on from there. My love and passion and interest for the brain is endless, because it's, neuroscience is a really exciting field because it's still very much in its infancy. We do know a lot about the brain now. I mean, we know an extraordinary amount. Like the last 10, 20 years, we've learned so much more than we did in the previous 100 years. But there's just so much more to learn. It's just so endlessly exciting, and so many of the discoveries that we're finding are completely counterintuitive as well. And as I discovered in my latest book, there's so much that we think about how the brain operates. It's actually just completely wrong.
Yeah, we're constantly learning new things, right? And then, is it true that the brain is, although massively researched in comparison to all the other body organs, the organ we still know least about?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it's, when you think about the complexity of the human brain, I mean, it is just absolutely staggering, because, your brain has 100 billion neurons, and each of those neurons can have up to 1,000 synapses. So the contact points in which our brain cells can communicate with each other, they're just endless in number. It's more stars than are in the Milky Way galaxy.
Yeah.
And so it's such a staggering level of complexity. And, and that's just one level at it. Then you have to go deeper into the neurogenetic and the epigenetic level. So it's the most complex system in the known universe. But it's it's so fascinating because it's, it's the organ we use to perceive the universe. It's the thing that makes the
Absolutely.
universe intelligible to us.
Yeah.
So that's also why I find it so fascinating. It transects so many different disciplines, including things like philosophy. So it's, but yeah, it's very, very complicated. But lots of amazing neuroscientists are working away to to figure more of it out.
Okay, let's dive directly into that book of yours. The Brain at Rest is standing here for anyone who's watching between us. What led you to look at the resting part of us and society and the brain?
Gosh, yeah, that's a very, very good question. So I essentially wrote the book for two reasons. The first was that I witnessed overwork and burnout in my own family. So my father worked himself to the point of burnout and now suffers from major depressive disorder as a result. And my mother too, her work ethic is actually even more extreme than my father's. And she now lives with blood pressure that's so high that the GP, that our doctor is basically the doctor is basically messaging her almost every day to ask for like constant blood pressure updates because her blood pressure is just so high because she's just working so hard all the time.
Oh,
And
sorry.
so I've sort of grown up with a family that I think it's fair to say have a pretty toxic relationship with work. They just
Okay.
overwork. And so I started to notice this in my own life as well. As I say in the book, it took me a long time to realize the importance of rest because I went through this as well. So just to give you an example, when I was doing my postdoc at the University of Washington, I'd be working in the lab all day, doing experiments, mentoring students, and then I would sort of finish at around 7, and then I would immediately go to like the nearby coffee shop, and I would work on grants and my first book until like 10 o'clock at night.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, needless to say, it was exhausting, and my goals always felt just out of reach. But I was in that phase of my life where all of the kind of old formulas seemed so relevant. So what I mean by that is this idea that if you just work harder and harder and harder, if you keep running faster and faster, then what you want will actually, you'll get what you want.
Yeah.
But I was becoming basically completely exhausted, burnt out, and I realized I couldn't sustain that pace indefinitely. So I started to ease off from my work a little bit. I still worked hard, but I eased off a bit.
Yeah.
And I noticed that not only was I feeling better physically, but mentally I was feeling better. So things like my memory was improving. I was more creative. I was able to write more fluidly. So, and I thought, this is interesting. And so I started to look into the neuroscience of rest. And really what I found was absolutely extraordinary. So basically, we have our understanding of work and rest completely wrong, completely upside down.
Now it gets interesting.
So, the widespread misconception, the widespread misunderstanding is that when you rest, your brain basically powers down. It switches off, that it's basically like a muscle and you stop using it, it relaxes, it powers down, it doesn't really do anything. The complete opposite is true. So when you rest, your brain actually activates a network that we call the default network. And that's a brain network that basically fans out across your brain and it allows you to think in completely new ways. So all of the research now shows that when you activate your default network with rest, you improve your intelligence, creativity, memory, problem-solving ability, emotional processing, social empathy, ability to predict the future, long-term productivity. It can even lower your risk of developing diseases like dementia and depression.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And it's really, really interesting because, the default network, it was discovered in 2001 by this really extraordinary neurologist called Marcus Raichle, who I interviewed in the book. It's only in the last few years that neuroscientists have really begun to flesh out the neurobiology of the default network.
Yeah.
And the really interesting thing is that it's only active when you rest. And by that, I mean it's only active when you step away from a cognitively demanding task. So when you work, when you're sitting at your desk, you're working, you're leaning into a cognitively demanding task, your brain activates what we call the executive network. And that's basically the brain's work network. That's what you use. That's what your brain uses when there's work to be done. And so the really interesting thing is that the executive network only actually occupies about 5 to 10% of the brain, whereas the default network occupies at least 20% of the brain. And these networks also work in competition with each other. So when your executive network is on and you're busy working, your default network's very quiet. But when you step away from work and you rest in lots of different ways, so like, mind wandering, going on walks in nature,
Yeah, that was
taking
my
naps,
next question.
that's when the default network comes online. And that's when you're able to enhance all of these cognitive abilities. And so it's a really extraordinary discovery because it's counterintuitive to the entire way that we view rest.
Absolutely. I mean, when I think back a few years, that sort of the burnout was nearly a badge of honor. And it was something happened that we sort of got invested in productivity in a sense that has become unhealthy, but we didn't realize that. Why did that happen, do you think?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I think one of the first things is that, we have this hustle mentality, basically. This idea that, working incredibly hard and hustling all the time is a sort of really aspirational life goal. It's a really healthy way to live. And it comes from a misunderstanding of productivity because, when you overwork, when you have that hustle mentality, you'll do some good things for your short-term productivity, but you'll completely destroy your long-term productivity. And you'll also miss out on all of the cognitive benefits and cognitive abilities that come from activating your resting brain, activating your default network with rest. And so, it comes from this unhealthy idea we have, and this misunderstanding about how our brains actually work. I say in the book, it's also, it's a cultural problem, obviously, as well, in terms of, we live in a society of basically of untrammeled capitalism, of this idea that you just keep working and working, you'll get what you want. And this idea, we don't have enough regulations in our society. Your boss shouldn't be able to call you on the weekend, for instance. But, I think it's also largely driven by the rise of technology and just the endless distractions we have. We're all always on our phone. And, I say in the book, we think of our phones as respite from work, when they're actually just distractions.
Absolutely.
Like, it's a trick, basically. It feels like rest because it's a shift from what you were doing earlier, but it's not rest for the brain at all. And so
I think that's important to emphasize that, because they go and, like doom scrolling, something they think they're resting, or sometimes I even heard, well, I'm watching TV to switch off. But that is not rest for the brain.
No, it's not. So, and the reason it's not is because it's very attention demanding.
Yeah.
It's very task on. So, when you're looking at your phone, you're engaged in a task. You're emailing, or you're on YouTube or TikTok or whatever. And, it's not allowing inner thought. It's not allowing the kind of self-generated thought that comes from, for instance, just staring out of the window and watching the trees, lining your street, or walking through a park and just listening to the rustling of the leaves. That's true rest for your brain. It needs to feel effortless. Whereas when it's very focused and attention demanding, like smartphones, like television, it's not activating your default network. So it's still a task. And so that's why I say in the book, it's all of these much more effortless, much more restful things for the brain that you actually need to be engaged in to truly rest your brain.
If you look at top athletes, really top athletes, and you look at how they train and their regimes, they really have very strong schedules when they're forced to do nothing. Even sometimes in front of big competitions and before games or whatever, they have like a day or two where they're not supposed to do anything. So no muscle training or nothing. So that is a little bit how you could also compare to, for your brain to work the best. I'm not saying you shouldn't be working for 2 days in straight. We're going to talk about this in a second. But, that resting component in order to then excel.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a chapter on sleep in the book. And, I talk about the mammoth sleep of people like Roger Federer, for instance.
Yeah.
Like, he sleeps 12 hours. in a day. He has a mammoth sleep, and he says, he's said that he needs that mammoth sleep in order to feel rested. And I'm not, obviously, like, most of us are not elite athletes, but the fact is the science still holds true for all of us, because sleep has such a powerful effect when it comes to activating your default network, and in particular naps. So there's this really interesting research that's come out just in the last 2 years by a group at UCL, and they found that people who have 30-minute naps actually have bigger brains than people who don't. And the difference is really significant. So it's 15 cubic centimeters, which is the volume of a small plum. So
Wow, that's a lot.
it's a huge amount. And when you think about the number of neurons and synapses and connections and cognitive ability that's going to be contained in that space, it's going to be hundreds of thousands, if not millions. And all of that cognitive potential that we're missing out on by not having that crucial 30-minute nap every day. So it's things like that we think of because of our misunderstanding of how the brain works in relation to work and rest. We think of that as just slacking,
Lazy.
being lazy, being really indulgent, and maybe even a bit irresponsible. But it's crucial for your not just activating your brain's default network, but actually having a beefier, chunkier brain.
What is a nap exactly? Do you fully sleep? Do you doze? What defines a nap?
So the research looking at the naps that basically increase the size of the brain, they found that a 30-minute nap in the middle of the day is what's really important. So if you have a longer nap than that, you'll wake up. I mean, sure, many of us have experienced this, and you feel a bit groggy,
sluggish,
tired,
like,
sluggish, and there'll be like a dip in your thinking skills and ability. The interesting thing is, though, the research shows that in the long run, even a slightly longer nap than 30 minutes actually will improve your creativity and problem-solving ability in the long run. So that's the interesting thing. But because you have that dip in thinking abilities and you feel groggy, really the sweet spot is 30 minutes in the middle of the day.
I always had this, I don't know if it still holds true, with we call it keychain sleep. So you take a nap, you have your keychain in your hand next to wherever you lie down. Because what happens as soon as you go into a deeper sleep state, you'll drop the keys. And that's when you wake up again.
Oh, interesting.
Because I always understood, or at least when you feel it yourself, is when you intend to do a 30-minute nap and all of a sudden, it's a weekend, for example, all of a sudden you sleep like 1.5 hours and you wake up and you feel like, oh my God, I'm like so tired. But that doesn't happen so much when you have this moment of not getting into that deep sleep. What happens there? And why do we feel so groggy?
When it's longer than 30 minutes, you're starting to then enter the period of the cycles of REM and non-REM sleep. So basically the way sleep operates is that you have like 4 to 6 cycles every night of like REM sleep, so rapid eye movement sleep, where you're dreaming, and that's where like all the creativity is happening in your brain. Your brain's like practicing scenarios and rehearsing ideas in your head that you might not think of during the day. It's really, really interesting because they think that dreams and REM sleep is basically your brain practicing things that your logical, rational brain during the day wouldn't allow.
Okay,
because it's these things kind of break the laws of physics. It's just it seems too strange, and so. But when you sleep, your brain is sort of free to form all these different connections and test out different ideas, which is another reason why it's really important to get, a good night's sleep. Once you go past half an hour, you're starting to go into one of those cycles. You're starting to be quite deep into one of those cycles, and so if you have a nap for a bit too long, you can basically be torn out of a REM cycle or a non-REM cycle. And, that's why you'll then feel a bit groggy. It's a bit of a shock to the system. It's really fascinating because we still don't know why it's the 30 minutes that seems to have not just a really positive impact on creativity and problem-solving abilities, but that it actually makes the brain chunkier. We still don't know quite why that is. There's some evidence to suggest that it's to do with the brain cleaning itself, that it actually helps stimulate a kind of deep cleanse for your brain. But there's also some evidence to suggest that it may be to do with what we call neurogenesis and synaptogenesis. And that's basically just the birth of new neurons and the birth of new synapses, that it's basically helping promote that function in your brain. But we still don't really understand the underlying neurobiology as to why it's half an hour, but it does seem to be half an hour.
I think that's fascinating, but also fascinating is just sleep in itself, right? Because sleep, gives the entire body the rest, but it has a huge impact also on the immune system and growth and all of that. What else happens with your brain when you are sleeping?
So lots of things are happening in your brain when you sleep. So you're resetting what we call your thermonuclear neurons. So that's
Hmm.
basically your body's way to like regulate temperature and lots of other like autonomic functions that are really important. Um, it's basically processing lots of things throughout your day. So it's consolidating memories. That's a really interesting thing that the brain does when you sleep as well. Filing through all of the experiences of your day and thinking, okay, what was important and what wasn't important? What can I let go of? And it's usually things that are emotionally charged or have some kind of emotional connection that the brain keeps hold of. Um, but it's really interesting because it's doing things like massively boosting your creativity by rehearsing all of these different events during the day, as well as like cleaning itself. But as I talk about in the book, it's also activating the default network, and so that network is just so important to be activated for your ability to problem solve, and just create self-generated thought. So there's loads of studies, for instance, that show that basically, it doesn't matter if you're a doctor or a train driver or a student, you will always perform better on a task if you rest before that task, precisely because you're activating your default network. And so one of my favorite studies was where they gave doctors and nurses time to basically have a 45-minute rest and basically sleep for 45 minutes. And then they told the other group, you don't have to do this. And, it was the group that had that 45-minute sleep before performing all these tasks who performed much better at all of these medical tasks. Even people who have to solve like quite complex problems. There's one quite interesting study where they basically took like two groups of people and they said, okay, we want you to figure out the mechanical and physical specifications of all of these different cars, but we're going to give you some time to like study the problem beforehand. And they said that to one group, and the other group, they said, okay, you guys, we want you just to like go out, leave the building, basically just do nothing, just chill out, have a rest, go for a walk, just gaze at the trees, do whatever you want, do something that you feel restful, you find restful. And it was the latter group who went off and did nothing and rested their brain and activated their brain's default network, who then performed far better on the mathematical and physical task of solving all these problems to do with the mechanics of all these different vehicles than the people who just sat there studying it really intently, working through the problem in a methodical way. Like they performed much better than that group.
I heard of this because there are so many different ways to rest, right? So I heard of this study recently. I hope I get that right. That there's massive research in the impact of meditation. I know not all people can meditate, but there was like a 10-minute meditation of some sort that sort of had the same resting impact on the brain than a full night's sleep.
Oh wow.
And that is comparably new. And I thought that was really fascinating, because it also is the question, yes, sleep is very important. So there's always this sort of guideline. I know you'd be better at this 7 to 9 hours or whatever, is sort of a healthy thing. But the question is also, how much rest do I need to give my brain in order to have all the benefits? And if you can't meditate, what are the other things that have stood out to you in researching this that are really beneficial?
So I think the first thing to say is my goal with this book is to get people to activate their default network, to activate their resting brain a lot more than they already are. So firstly, it's really important to say we need to be taking a lot more breaks
Hmm.
throughout our day. So whenever you have the opportunity to take a break, take a break. If you can take a 5 to 10 minute break every hour where you're just staring out of the window, like do that, take that
Okay.
break. don't feel guilty about it. It's not indulgent. It's not lazy. It's not irresponsible. It's really essential for your brain's health.
But don't take your phone out or something.
No,
That is
don't
not
take your
rest.
phone out.
Yeah.
That's not rest. So, if I could wave a magic wand, I would have us immediately on the 4-day work week. I mean, all of the evidence now shows, they did a huge trial in Iceland. They're about to do another one in Japan. The evidence shows that when you have a 4-day work week, productivity either stays the same or improves in the long run. So, and that's because, we're activating our default network, we're gaining all of these cognitive benefits. And it's really important to say as well that, workers need tailored rest and personalized time off. So we need to encourage employers to basically allow their workers to have a conversation with them and say, these are the things I find restful. I need more time off to rest my brain.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not, lots of employers will think, well, isn't that at loggerheads with my bottom line, with profit? And it's not. All of the evidence now shows that overwork actually damages a company's bottom line. And actually, when you allow your employees more time to rest and you can do things like the 4-day work week, that productivity goes up and that your workers are much healthier and producing much better work. And in terms of what you can do, there's lots of things. So, mind wandering is really important. I really want people to just take a few minutes every day out of your daily routine and just stare into space.
Okay.
Just stare up at the sky. If you're in nature, just stare at the trees. If you're by the ocean, just stare at the lapping waves. Stare at the tree outside your window. Just stare at the books lining your shelves. Just stare into space, because that is that's linked to really strong default network activity. I also want people to get that 30-minute nap every day.
Okay.
Really important. I also want people to basically spend a lot more time embracing green spaces and nature.
Yeah.
So there's been a lot of research done on what we call forest bathing, green spaces. We know that it's really good for our physiological health, good for our biology in lots of ways. But there's really interesting research now looking at its effect on the brain. So we know now, for instance, that when you spend time in a green space, and this can be, you don't have to go to a forest, just a park, or, if you have a small bit of green space, a small garden or a small park nearby, when you do that, your brain's default network actually shifts from very busy and anxious beta waves to much more relaxing, daydreaming, and creative alpha waves, and even very meditative theta waves. So basically, the electrophysiology of the brain completely shifts. The brain waves completely change. And when you move into those alpha and theta waves, that's when you're much more creative and much more able to solve problems. It's also worth mentioning as well that when you spend time in nature, you're exposed to these plant chemicals called phytoncides. They're basically natural oils that protect trees from bacteria.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're always being emitted by plants. I mean, they're basically everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
But when you breathe them in, they have a really profound effect on your immune system. So they massively boost your immune system. So there's a really interesting research showing that people who spent 3 days camping had their natural killer cell, so like a really important immune cell.
Yeah.
It was ramped up by 40%, and that lasted a month after they then left the forest. And at the same time, we know from all of these cognitive studies that people who spend time in nature and green spaces, they improve their creativity and problem-solving abilities by 50%.
That's incredible.
They improve their memory recall by 20%.
Yeah.
And this is compared to, looking at people who just spend time in urban environments. It's regardless of the weather. And really interestingly, you need to go out into real nature and real green spaces, but even a virtual image of a green space
Really?
versus an urban space will have some of those benefits. Yeah.
I mean, whoever knows me, I know I'm famously known for walking everywhere, and ideally I do it in nature or in a park, but I recognize it in myself. If I do walk, every day it's like minimum an hour. Sometimes I just use it to go from A to B in between meetings, and if I ideally happen to go through a green space, but I'm better for it. every day. It's like I just feel calmer. I feel, you might not immediately feel it like, wow, I'm so much more creative, but I'm especially just calmer. I'm just, things just settle down a little bit. So I guess that's what's happening.
That's what's
right?
happening. Yeah, that's your creativity and problem solving being ramped up. It's also walking, especially as you mentioned. That's we now know that when you walk, your skeletal muscle actually secretes these molecules called myokines, which in the field they're dubbed hope molecules because they have this extraordinary power to cross the blood-brain barrier. Not many things cross the blood-brain barrier. Your brain is very selective about what it lets in and what doesn't let in. But their myokines actually cross the blood-brain barrier, and they act as an antidepressant, quite a potent antidepressant. And that's why, when you're feeling quite sad about something or anxious about something, going on that long walk. I mean, so many of us do this because I think, even without knowing about the science as to what's actually happening in your brain and in your body, we kind of know intuitively, I need to go for a walk. I need to have that time of self-reflection and introspection. And, again, we think of it in a purely psychological way, but it is that, but it's more than that as well. There are real underlying neurophysiological things happening, like myokines, coming into your brain and helping you with those feelings.
Are there any cultures that are better at resting? Because if I look at some cultures like, I don't know, Spain, Italy, when sometimes they're forced to take a siesta, famous siesta. But is their productivity better, or is there other cultures that do it even better? Have you come across any of those?
Yeah, there are. So I think, it's safe to say that Europe is much better at this than America.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of obvious to everyone.
Yeah.
Like the American work ethic, the American work mentality, the shortness of the holidays in America, it's really bad for brain health.
Yeah.
And also, crucially, again, really bad for long-term productivity. As I say in the book, I'm not anti-ambition. I'm not anti-productivity. I'm pro-productivity and I'm pro-ambition.
I think that's important to say.
Yeah.
This is not about being lazy or idle.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But we need to be much smarter about how we achieve that. And the overwork ethic that many people have leads to short-term productivity, but not long-term productivity, and we're missing out on all these cognitive benefits. It's also worth mentioning, actually, that things in terms of overwork and burnout, things are moving very much in the wrong direction. So globally, there are now 745,000 deaths a year from overwork.
Yeah.
And that's a 29% increase since 2000.
Wow.
We now know that 3 in 5 employees report a lack of interest, motivation, and energy. And that's a 38% increase since 2019.
Wow.
So, even though working conditions are better today than they were in the past, there's no question about that, we are in a dramatic regression in terms of burnout and overwork.
But do you think it's really only overwork, or are there other challenges as well, which we then accidentally take as rest?
There's a lot of interesting research looking at the effects of what I described in the book as untrammeled capitalism. Inequality is on the rise in so many places. It's, all of these things are going to have negative impacts on our mental health. The endless distractions from our smartphones and technology. Things like AI, which I like AI. I think it's going to obviously revolutionize so many industries. It will it'll help us find cures for diseases. It will help us figure out how to, process and discover more fresh water. It will solve lots of big problems.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we are moving into a world where we're using it with our work to the point where, because things are becoming much easier with AI, that we're just doing more and more and more. And so because we're becoming much more efficient, but ironically, as a result, we're just doing more and more and more and more. And I think that also is part of the reason why people are overworking, because, paradoxically, things are made a little bit easier. So instead of saying, okay, I'm going to use technology and AI to perform this job that I want to get done today, and then I'm going to rest, people are saying, oh, that was pretty quick. I'll do another one. I'll do another bit. I'll do more and more and more. And so I think it's a cultural problem. It's a technology problem. There are lots of things feeding into these statistics. Psychologically, overwork, it starts as a kind of feeling of dissatisfaction.
Yeah.
Like lots of us, lots of us are aware of this. It's kind of, you're dissatisfied with your job, but it's like a manageable feeling, so you kind of ignore it. But that then moves to cynicism, where you just don't really care anymore. You just think, okay, this is just something I have to do. I don't care about it. I just have to do it. But that then gets to the point where it moves to the phase of dehumanization, and that's a complete kind of emotional detachment from your colleagues, a kind of emotional hardening, and that then leads to these feelings of productivity guilt, that you're not doing enough, hopelessness, dread, even incompetence. And then you kind of wear those feelings like skin, as if they were there all along. And the really terrifying thing about this sort of progression of overwork into burnout and the progression of these symptoms is that it actually takes your brain up to 3 years to recover.
3 years?
Up to 3 years. So they've done loads of really interesting studies.
So once you end up in a burnout, you mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Depending on like the severity of burnout, it can be anywhere from a few months to 3 years.
That's
so
a
they've
long
done
time.
these huge studies, like particularly in Sweden, where they test loads of people on their cognitive abilities, their memory, their problem solving, their creativity, and they look at people who are just clearly overworking and burnt out, and then they come back to them a lot many years later, and it sometimes takes up to 3 years for people to return to baseline, basically, because they've overworked. So it's not just about activating the default network to reap all of the cognitive benefits. It's also about activating it simply to activate your resting brain, to step away from work, to step away from your executive network. I say in the book, it's the executive network it's kind of been like a hero in our productivity narrative. It's like, okay, there's work to be done. I'll just tap into the executive network, and very sort of very kind of American. Let's just get to it. Work to be done.
Yeah.
But we've become so enamored with this network, so hell-bent on squeezing every last drop out of it, that we've completely overtaxed it. We've overused it. And
I remember that in America, because my children went to school in the US, and they had homework. I looked at it from at some point, and I said, this is ridiculous. They were sitting there until 10 o'clock in the evening or longer. And when they got older, until 12, they were constantly underslept. It was like, and then I remember I was talking to some teachers sometimes, like, well, if we gave less homework, there were many parents who were going to tell us their kids don't have enough to do. And I could definitely tell that the children were suffering from this. Because of it, they were constantly feeling they're not good enough, they're behind, they didn't get enough sleep. So this is a vicious cycle that starts. And clearly you didn't see better outcomes anywhere, right?
It lends itself as well to this interesting idea that, or this interesting reality that, all of the things that we were discouraged from doing as children, like daydreaming, mind wandering, are actually really good. Playing, yeah. I mean, just finding micro moments of play throughout your day is so good for your brain, because first of all, it's task off.
Yeah.
So it's going to be activating your resting brain, your default network. It's very imaginative, and we know the neuroscience of play is so fascinating. There's all this research showing that it stimulates what we call neuroplasticity, and that's the brain's ability to basically reorganize itself and grow new synapses and connections. And the amazing thing about neuroplasticity is that it can even compensate for a lot of damage. So it's your brain's way of basically compensating for damage and for lots of other problems that might arise later on in life.
And we learn much faster when we play, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's because you've got increased neuroplasticity, and play itself, it's unstructured. It's very imaginative. It just allows your brain that flexibility to think much more clearly.
Also very important for little children, right? Because they're, as much as I recall, it's how the brain cells develop in young years is through play, mainly.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So there are all these critical windows of neurodevelopment where play is really important.
Yeah.
If you sit a child down during these critical windows of neurodevelopment and you're really strict with them and you say, you're not allowed to daydream, you're not allowed to play, you must read this text, that's going to be really bad for their brain. It's going to be really bad for their brain's development.
What are the critical windows of development?
So there are lots of them. There are really important ones basically when children are like, when they're newborns and when they're toddlers. But the interesting thing is neuroscientists are finding more and more critical periods
Okay.
throughout development, because we know that the brain keeps developing right up until you're at least 25.
Yeah, that's massive.
So, and it goes beyond that as well, because for a long time it was thought, for instance, that that your central nervous system, didn't develop new neurons, that neurogenesis wasn't really happening, and that actually once you've got the brain cells you've got, that's it for the rest of your life. But there's a lot of evidence now challenging that and saying actually, there are these parts of the brain, like deep inside the brain, where there are these pools of neural stem cells, and that they have the potential to go on to become fully grown neurons. And
Okay.
so, even just allowing your brain the ability to have a healthy pool of these neural stem cells by doing things like play and having healthy neurodevelopment is so important for your resting brain.
That's incredible. How do you incorporate all of that into your own life?
So I basically take rest a lot more seriously now.
Has that changed to before? Because
yes. Because learning about the neuroscience of rest and all the things it's doing to the brain, I'm thinking, oh my God, wow, okay, this is really important. I need to spend more time resting and not feeling guilty about it. So before I would work, like 10, 12-hour days, I would just grind it out thinking, well, I'm going to get more done. Now I will basically work solidly for like 4 to 6 hours every day. But my mindset to it has changed. So what I'll do is, I'll set like a daily goal and I'll achieve that goal. But I will then basically intersperse my days now with time spent gazing out of the window, going on walks in the nearby park, getting that crucial brain enlarging 30-minute nap. And also just allowing myself time to simply do nothing and not feel guilty about it. In one of the chapters I spoke to a really extraordinary person, Olga Mecking. She's this really, really interesting Dutch writer and thinker, and she wrote a book about Niksen.
Yes.
And that's basically the Dutch philosophy of doing nothing. The word Niksen literally means nothing-ing. And it's basically a philosophy of rest, of doing nothing. And so, I try and incorporate that into my life as well. And so it's really about, Niksen is it's basically about finding the moments in between things. It's about saying to yourself, okay, I've got work to do, but actually I'm going to go sit on the sofa, I'm going to have a cup of tea, and I'm just going to stare out of the window. And I'm not going to feel guilty about that, because it's activating my default network. It's improving my memory. It's improving my ability to think critically about things. It's going to improve my ability to perform whatever task I have coming up. It's integral to the work I'm about to do. This is the message that I really want to get across with this science. Rest and work are not in opposition with each other.
Yeah.
And that's not only have we thought that's how it is, we still think that's how it is. It's not. Rest is the crucial ingredient of work. It's the thing that's integral to work. What else do I do? I do a lot of active rest as well, like exercise.
Okay. Exercise is rest.
It is, yeah. Exercise is rest, yeah.
Good.
So lots of people I spoke to for the book, I was saying, what do you find restful? And quite a few people would say exercise. They would say, I need to go for a long run to, burn off all of the stress and feel rested. And again, there's really interesting underlying neuroscience to explain that. So really interesting study in the last year or so shows that for your brain, you only actually need about 25 minutes of exercise a week to grow a bigger brain. So that breaks down to, it's like 4 minutes a day. So even just 4 minutes a day of light exercise literally grows your brain.
That's incredible.
And we think it's to do with things like a neurotransmitter called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And that's really important to help neurons sprout new synapses and connections. And it can even slow the progression of things like Alzheimer's disease. But again, we're still figuring out exactly why that is. But, exercise has such a profound effect on the brain. And it also activates the default network as well, especially if you're, running in nature and you're getting all of those, we call them soft fascinations. So soft fascinations are things that hold your attention in a very effortless way. So there's a reason when you go to like a forest or you go to the ocean and you just stare out, everything is holding your attention, but it feels effortless.
Yeah.
And that's in complete contrast to what we call hard fascinations, which are things like your phone, train billboards, overbearing bosses, ridiculous deadlines, like all of these things that basically draw away your focus and attention and cause cognitive fatigue. So, if you go for a run in a park, you're going to be getting all of the benefits of increasing the size of your brain, but also activating your default network because you're exposed to the soft fascinations, you're exposed to phytoncides, you're getting all of those hope molecules, those myokines crossing your blood-brain barrier and acting as an antidepressant. It's so much more powerful to a healthy brain than we ever imagined.
What about listening to music?
Yeah, so this is really interesting because a few people have asked me about this, and also like podcasts and things, right?
Okay.
Like and audiobooks and things like that. So it's really interesting, the research in this area, because on the one hand, listening to natural sounds, so like listening to like the birds chirping and like again wind, rustling of the leaves, listening to natural sounds versus artificial sounds does activate your default network much more. So it's better to listen to natural sounds. However, it depends on what you're listening to, and also depends on, to use reading as an example, what you're reading. So if you're listening to a podcast or an audiobook and you really enjoy it, and it's not too cognitively taxing, and it's stimulating things like your imagination, your self-reflection, those are all default network functions. So it is activating your default network. Whereas if, to use reading as an example, if you're scanning through a text in a very goal-orientated, work-focused way, because you're trying to find something for work, that's activating your executive network. That's work for the brain.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're reading a thriller or something that you just absolutely love, then that is activating your default network. So music as well. Music, if it's enjoyable and you find it relaxing, and interestingly, sad music seems to activate the default network more than other types of music.
Well, and classical versus hard rock?
I don't know if they've looked at classical versus hard rock. Someone should suggest that to the researchers, because that would be really interesting.
Because I mean, just for myself, it was like, if I listen to classical music, it sort of calms me down. Hard rock, not so much. I mean, it puts me in a different mood, perhaps. But sort of classic, I can do stuff on the side.
You find it calming,
yeah.
I mean,
but I don't know.
I mean, because I find classical music calming. Hard rock, I mean,
any kind of rock, sort of.
I mean, I think I know one or two people that might say they find that relaxing.
Okay.
But yeah, with the sad music activating the default network, it does kind of make sense when you think about it just intuitively, because whenever you listen to a sad song, you're immediately introspective. You're immediately, your mind starts to drift, and you start to think about, that person in my life years ago, I wonder how they're doing, or like, I wonder what I want out of my life. And it provokes all of those deep inner emotions, and that is all default network activity. So yeah, listening to music's fine, and if you don't already listen to some sad music, try and incorporate some sad music into your routine.
Sad music. So if someone was out there listening now and really has a hard time finding rest because of, I don't know, the circumstances or how he or she has been working before and stuff, what would your sort of little entry point recommendation be? How you just start experimenting a little bit?
I think one of the best ways to start experimenting is to, as I said before, just try and take a few minutes out of your normal routine every day, just to stare into space, just to stare out of the window. It's quite...
not so difficult.
It's not so difficult. In the morning, for instance, I go out onto the street, and I've got my bike with me, but instead of just setting off, I'll take a minute actually just to look at the trees lining the street. And then I'll cycle off. Just find little micro moments where you just stop and you pause and you just let your mind drift. I think that's a good entryway to then lead on to things like getting at least 20 minutes in green space every day. Really interesting study looking at 20,000 people showed that 2 hours a week in green space is what you need to have a huge impact on your neurological and psychological health. So that's 20 minutes a day. But obviously, as you said, some people might find getting that extra that 20 minutes a day to go to a park, they might find that difficult. But it will lead on to things like that, and lead on to things like the 30-minute nap, and things like embracing quiet as well. I mean, we take peace and quiet for granted, but
It's not.
it's really not. Like, persistent noise is so bad for your brain in so many ways. Finding as much peace and quiet as you possibly can has a really a tremendous impact on your brain health. I think as well, one of the main ways I would encourage people to sort of start taking rest for their brains much more seriously is really to leave work at work.
Yeah.
Because I think that's one of the main things as well, because that's something we're all guilty of.
Yeah.
And we have our smartphones, we're always on our email. We're checking our work emails just before we go to bed, and over the weekend. I mean, doing it before you go to bed is particularly bad as well, because your brain's exposed to lots of artificial light, and we now know that melatonin, the sleep hormone, has a really powerful anti-cancer effect. And interestingly, they now think that the reason there's such a steep rise in cancer among young people is because young people are just doing this.
Affecting their melatonin.
Yeah, they're blocking their melatonin.
Wow.
So, put your phone down before you go to sleep. Don't look at your phone. Leave work at work. Actually say to yourself, okay, I'm not going to look at my phone. I'm not going to reply to emails. I'm going to spend the weekend, walking through a park and actually resting my brain, like truly resting my brain.
And whoever wants to learn even more, I could continue this conversation forever. They should grab a copy of your book, The Brain at Rest. Thank you so much. It was absolutely fascinating. We're sadly running out of time. Otherwise, I would sit here more than 3 hours because I keep on learning so much. So thank you so much for coming in and sharing all that knowledge with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephanie.
Dr. Joseph Jebelli, neuroscientist, author, and expert on brain health. I hope you'll be able to take his advice and really prioritize resting your own brain every now and then. If you'd like to get a copy of Dr. Jebelli's book, The Brain at Rest, all the details are in the show notes. And do click follow whilst you're there for more expert advice on really taking time to look after yourself. Join me next time on How Do We Manage?